Chapter 16 of the Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 16. Thou glorious mirror, where the Almighty's form glasses itself in tempests, in all time, calm or convulsed, in breeze or gale or storm, icing the pole, or in the torrid clime, dark heaving, boundless, endless, and sublime. The image of eternity, the throne of the invisible, even from out thy slime the monsters of the deep are made, each zone obeys thee, thou goest forth dread, fathomless, alone. Attributed to Byron. As the day advanced, that portion of the inmates of the vessel which had the liberty of doing so appeared on deck. As yet the sea was not very high, from which it was inferred that the cutter was still under the lee of the islands, but it was apparent to all who understood the lake that they were about to experience one of the heavy autumnal gales of that region. Land was nowhere visible, and the horizon on every side exhibited that gloomy void which lends to all views on vast bodies of water the sublimity of mystery. The swells, or as landsmen term them, the waves, were short and curling, breaking of necessity sooner than the longer seas of the ocean, while their element itself, instead of presenting that beautiful hue which rivals the deep tint of the southern sky, looked green and angry, though wanting in the luster that is derived from the rays of the sun. The soldiers were soon satisfied with the prospect, and one by one they disappeared, until none were left on deck but the crew, the Sergeant, Cap, Pathfinder, the Quartermaster, and Mabel. There was a shade on the brow of the last, who had been made acquainted with the real state of things, and who had fruitlessly ventured an appeal in favor of Jasper's restoration to the command. A night's rest and a night's reflection appeared also to have confirmed the Pathfinder in his opinion of the young man's innocence, and he too had made a warm appeal on behalf of his friend, though with the same want of success. Several hours passed away, the wind gradually getting heavier and the sea rising, until the motion of the cutter compelled Mabel and the Quartermaster to retreat also. Cap wore several times, and it was now evident that the Scud was drifting into the broader and deeper parts of the lake, the seas raging down upon her in a way that none but a vessel of superior mould and build could have long ridden and withstood. All this, however, gave Cap no uneasiness, but like the hunter that pricks his ears at the sound of the horn, or the war horse that paws and snorts with pleasure at the roll of the drum, the whole scene awakened all that was man within him, and instead of the captious, supercilious, and dogmatic critic, quarrelling with trifles and exaggerating immaterial things, he began to exhibit the qualities of the hardy and experienced seaman which he truly was. The hands soon imbibed a respect for his skill, and though they wondered at the disappearance of their old commander and the pilot, for which no reason had been publicly given, they soon yielded an implicit and cheerful obedience to the new one. "This bit of fresh water, after all, brother Dunham, has some spirit, I find," cried Cap about noon, rubbing his hands in pure satisfaction at finding himself once more wrestling with the elements. "The wind seems to be an honest old-fashioned gale, and the seas have a fanciful resemblance to those on the Gulf Stream. I like this, Sergeant, I like this, and shall get to respect your lake, if it holds out 24 hours longer in the fashion in which it has begun." "Land ho!" shouted the man who was stationed on the forecastle. Cap hurried forward, and there, sure enough, the land was visible through the drizzle, at the distance of about half a mile, the cutter heading directly towards it. The first impulse of the old seaman was to give an order to stand by to wear off shore, but the cool-headed soldier restrained him. "By going a little nearer," said the Sergeant, "some of us may recognize the place. Most of us know the American shore in this part of the lake, and it will be something gained to learn our position." Very true,
If indeed there is any chance of that, we will hold on. What is this off here, a little on our weather bow? It looks like a low headland." "The garrison, by Jove!" exclaimed the other, whose trained eye sooner recognized the military outlines than the less instructed senses of his connection. The Sergeant was not mistaken. There was the fort, sure enough, though it looked dim and indistinct through the fine rain, as if it were seen in the dusk of evening or the haze of morning. The low, sodded, and verdant ramparts, the sombre palisades, now darker than ever with water, the roof of a house or two, the tall solitary flagstaff, with its halyards blown steadily out into a curve that appeared traced in immovable lines in the air, were all soon to be seen, though no sign of animated life could be discovered. Even the sentinel was housed, and at first it was believed that no eye would detect the presence of their own vessel. But the unceasing vigilance of a border garrison did not slumber. One of the lookouts probably made the interesting discovery. A man or two were seen on some elevated stands, and then the entire ramparts next the lake were dotted with human beings. The whole scene was one in which sublimity was singularly relieved by the picturesque. The raging of the tempest had a character of duration that rendered it easy to imagine it might be a permanent feature of the spot. The roar of the wind was without intermission, and the raging water answered to its dull but grand strains with hissing spray, a menacing wash, and sullen surges. The drizzle made a medium for the eye which closely resembled that of a thin mist, softening and rendering mysterious the images it revealed, while the genial feeling that is apt to accompany a gale of wind on water contributed to aid the milder influences of the moment. The dark, interminable forest hove up out of the obscurity, grand, sombre, and impressive, while the solitary, peculiar, and picturesque glimpses of life that were caught in and about the fort formed a refuge for the eye to retreat to when oppressed with the more imposing objects of nature. "They see us," said the Sergeant, "and they think we have returned on account of the gale, and have fallen to leeward of the port. Yes, there is Major Duncan himself on the northeastern bastion. I know him by his height, and by the officers around him." "Sergeant, it would be worth standing a little jeering if we could fetch into the river, and come safely to an anchor. In that case, too, we might land this Master Eau douce and purify the boat." "It would indeed; but as poor a sailor as I am, I well know it cannot be done. Nothing that sails the lake can turn to windward against this gale, and there is no anchorage outside in weather like this." "I know it, I see it, Sergeant; and pleasant as is that sight to you landsmen, we must leave it. For myself, I am never so happy in heavy weather as when I am certain the land is behind me." The Scud had now forged so near in, that it became indispensable to lay her head off shore again, and the necessary orders were given. The storm staysail was set forward, the gaff lowered, the helm put up, and the light craft, that seemed to sport with the elements like a duck, fell off a little, drew ahead swiftly, obeyed her rudder, and was soon flying away on the top of the surges, dead before the gale. While making this rapid flight, though the land still remained in view on her larboard beam, the fort and the groups of anxious spectators on its rampart were swallowed up in the mist. Then followed the evolutions necessary to bring the head of the cutter up to the wind, when she again began to wallow her weary way towards the north shore. Hours now passed before any further change was made, the wind increasing in force, until even the dogmatical Cap fairly admitted it was blowing a thorough gale of wind. About sunset the Scud wore again to keep her off the north shore during the hours of darkness, and at midnight her temporary master, who, by questioning the crew in an indirect manner, had obtained some general knowledge of the size and shape of the lake, believed himself to be about midway between the two shores. The height and length of the seas aided this impression, and it must be added that Cap by this time began to feel a respect for fresh water which 24 hours earlier he would have derided as impossible. Just as the night turned, the fury of the wind became so great that he found it impossible to bear up against it,
the water falling on the deck of the little craft in such masses as to cause it to shake to the centre, and, though a vessel of singularly lively qualities, to threaten to bury it beneath its weight. The people of the Scud averred that never before had they been out in such a tempest, which was true; for, possessing a perfect knowledge of all the rivers and headlands and havens, Jasper would have carried the cutter in shore long ere this, and placed her in safety in some secure anchorage. But Cap still disdained to consult the young master, who continued below, determining to act like a mariner of the broad ocean. It was 1 in the morning when the storm staysail was again got on the Scud, the head of the mainsail lowered, and the cutter put before the wind. Although the canvas now exposed was merely a rag in surface, the little craft nobly justified the use of the name she bore. For 8 hours did she scud in truth, and it was almost with the velocity of the gulls that wheeled wildly over her in the tempest, apparently afraid to alight in the boiling cauldron of the lake. The dawn of day brought little change, for no other horizon became visible than the little circle of drizzling sky and water already described, in which it seemed as if the elements were rioting in a sort of chaotic confusion. During this time the crew and passengers of the cutter were of necessity passive. Jasper and the pilot remained below; but, the motion of the vessel having become easier, nearly all the rest were on deck. The morning meal had been taken in silence, and eye met eye, as if their owners asked each other, in dumb show, what was to be the end of this strife in the elements. Cap, however, was perfectly composed, and his face brightened, his step grew firmer, and his whole air more assured, as the storm increased, making larger demands on his professional skill and personal spirit. He stood on the forecastle, his arms crossed, balancing his body with a seaman's instinct, while his eyes watched the caps of the seas, as they broke and glanced past the reeling cutter, itself in such swift motion, as if they were the Scud flying athwart the sky. At this sublime instant, one of the hands gave the unexpected cry of "A sail!" There was so much of the wild and solitary character of the wilderness about Ontario, that one scarcely expected to meet with a vessel on its waters. The Scud herself, to those who were in her, resembled a man threading the forest alone, and the meeting was like that of two solitary hunters beneath the broad canopy of leaves that then covered so many millions of acres on the continent of America. The peculiar state of the weather served to increase the romantic, almost supernatural appearance of the passage. Cap alone regarded it with practised eyes, and even he felt his iron nerves thrill under the sensations that were awakened by the wild features of the scene. The strange vessel was about 2 cables' length ahead of the Scud, standing by the wind athwart her bows, and steering a course to render it probable that the latter would pass within a few yards of her. She was a full-rigged ship, and, seen through the misty medium of the tempest, the most experienced eye could detect no imperfection in her gear or construction. The only canvas she had set was a close-reefed main topsail, and 2 small storm staysails, one forward and the other aft. Still the power of the wind pressed so hard upon her as to bear her down nearly to her beam ends, whenever the hull was not righted by the buoyancy of some wave under her lee. Her spars were all in their places, and by her motion through the water, which might have equalled 4 knots in the hour, it was apparent that she steered a little free. "The fellow must know his position well," said Cap, as the cutter flew down towards the ship with a velocity almost equalling that of the gale, "for he is standing boldly to the southward, where he expects to find anchorage or a haven. No man in his senses would run off free in that fashion, that was not driven to scudding like ourselves, who did not perfectly understand where he was going." "We have made an awful run, captain," returned the man to whom this remark had been addressed. "That is the French king's ship, Lee Montcalm, Le Montcalm, and she is standing in for the Niagara, where her owner has a garrison and a port. We've made an awful run of it." "Ay, bad luck to him! Frenchman like, he skulks into port the moment he sees an English bottom."
"It might be well for us if we could follow him," returned the man, shaking his head despondingly, "for we are getting into the end of a bay up here at the head of the lake, and it is uncertain whether we ever get out of it again." "Pooh, man, pooh! We have plenty of sea room, and a good English hull beneath us. We are no Johnny Crapauds to hide ourselves behind a point or a fort on account of a puff of wind. Mind your helm, sir!" The order was given on account of the menacing appearance of the approaching passage. The Scud was now heading directly for the forefoot of the Frenchman, and the distance between the two vessels having diminished to 100 yards, it was momentarily questionable if there was room to pass. "Port, sir, port!" shouted Cap. "Port your helm, and pass astern!" The crew of the Frenchman were seen assembling to windward, and a few muskets were pointed, as if to order the people of the Scud to keep off. Gesticulations were observed, but the sea was too wild and menacing to admit of the ordinary expedients of war. The water was dripping from the muzzles of 2 or 3 light guns on board the ship, but no one thought of loosening them for service in such a tempest. Her black sides, as they emerged from a wave, glistened and seemed to frown, but the wind howled through her rigging, whistling the 1,000 notes of a ship, and the hails and cries that escape a Frenchman with so much readiness were inaudible. "Let him halloo himself hoarse," growled Cap. "This is no weather to whisper secrets in. Port, sir, port!" The man at the helm obeyed, and the next send of the sea drove the Scud down upon the quarter of the ship, so near her that the old mariner himself recoiled a step, in a vague expectation that, at the next surge ahead, she would drive bows foremost directly into the planks of the other vessel. But this was not to be. Rising from the crouching posture she had taken, like a panther about to leap, the cutter dashed onward, and at the next instant she was glancing past the stern of her enemy, just clearing the end of her spanker boom with her own lower yard. The young Frenchman, who commanded Le Montcalm, leaped on the taffrail, and with that high-toned courtesy which relieves even the worst acts of his countrymen, he raised his cap and smiled a salutation as the Scud shot past. There were bonhomie and good taste in this act of courtesy, when circumstances allowed of no other communications, but they were lost on Cap, who, with an instinct quite as true to his race, shook his fist menacingly, and muttered to himself, "Ay, ay, it's damn lucky for you I've no armament on board here, or I'd send you in to get new cabin windows fitted. Sergeant, he's a humbug." "'Twas civil, brother Cap," returned the other, lowering his hand from the military salute which his pride as a soldier had induced him to return. "'Twas civil, and that's as much as you can expect from a Frenchman. What he really meant by it no one can say." "He is not heading up to this sea without an object, neither. Well, let him run in, if he can get there. We will keep the lake, like hardy English mariners." This sounded gloriously, but Cap eyed with envy the glittering black mass of the Montcalm's hull, her waving topsail, and the misty tracery of her spars, as she grew less and less distinct, and finally disappeared in the drizzle, in a form as shadowy as that of some unreal image. Gladly would he have followed in her wake had he dared, for, to own the truth, the prospect of another stormy night in the midst of the wild waters that were raging around him brought little consolation. Still, he had too much professional pride to betray his uneasiness, and those under his care relied on his knowledge and resources, with the implicit and blind confidence that the ignorant are apt to feel. A few hours succeeded, and darkness came again to increase the perils of the Scud. A lull in the gale, however, had induced Cap to come by the wind once more, and throughout the night the cutter was lying to as before, head reaching as a matter of course, and occasionally wearing to keep off the land. It is unnecessary to dwell on the incidents of this night, which resembled those of any other gale of wind. There were the pitching of the vessel, the hissing of the waters, the dashing of spray, the shocks that menaced annihilation to the little craft as she plunged into the seas, the undying howl of the wind, and the fearful drift. The last was the most serious danger,
for, though exceedingly weatherly under her canvas, and totally without top hamper, the Scud was so light that the combing of the swells would seem at times to wash her down to leeward with a velocity as great as that of the surges themselves. During this night Cap slept soundly and for several hours. The day was just dawning when he felt himself shaken by the shoulder, and, arousing himself, he found the Pathfinder standing at his side. During the gale the guide had appeared little on deck, for his natural modesty told him that seamen alone should interfere with the management of the vessel, and he was willing to show the same reliance on those who had charge of the Scud as he expected those who followed through the forest to manifest in his own skill. But he now thought himself justified in interfering, which he did in his own unsophisticated and peculiar manner. "Sleep is sweet, Master Cap," said he, as soon as the eyes of the latter were fairly open, and his consciousness had sufficiently returned. "Sleep is sweet, as I know from experience, but life is sweeter still. Look about you, and see if this is exactly the moment for a commander to be off his feet." How now, Master Pathfinder?" growled Cap, in the first moments of his awakened faculties. "Are you two getting on the side of the grumblers? When ashore I admired your sagacity in running through the worst shoals without a compass, and since we have been afloat, your meekness and submission have been as pleasant as your confidence on your own ground. I little expected such a summons from you." "As for myself, Master Cap, I feel I have my gifts, and I believe they'll interfere with those of no other man; but the case may be different with Mabel Dunham. She has her gifts too, it is true, but they are not rude like ours, but gentle and womanish as they ought to be. It's on her account that I speak, not on my own." "Ay, I begin to understand. The girl is a good girl, my worthy friend; but she is a soldier's daughter and a sailor's niece, and ought not to be too tame or too tender in a gale. Does she show any fear?" "Not she, not she. Mabel is a woman, but she is reasonable and silent. Not a word have I heard from her concerning our doings, though I do think, Master Cap, she would like it better if Jasper Eau douce were put into his proper place, and things were restored to their old situation like. This is human nature." "I'll warrant it, girl like and Dunham like too. Anything is better than an old uncle, and everybody knows more than an old seaman. This is human nature, Master Pathfinder, and damn me if I'm the man to sheer a fathom, starboard or port, for all the human nature that can be found in a minx of 20, ay, or," lowering his voice a little, "for all that can be paraded in his Majesty's 55th Regiment of Foot. I've not been at sea 40 years, to come up on this bit of fresh water to be taught human nature. How this gale holds out! It blows as hard at this moment as if Boreas had just clapped his hand upon the bellows. And what is all this to leeward?" rubbing his eyes. "Land, as sure as my name is Cap, and high land too." The Pathfinder made no immediate answer, but shaking his head, he watched the expression of his companion's face, with a look of strong anxiety in his own. "Land, as certain as this is the Scud," repeated Cap. "A lee shore, and that too within a league of us, with as pretty a line of breakers as one could find on the beach of all Long Island." "And is that encouraging, or is it disheartening?" inquired the Pathfinder. "Ha! Encouraging! Disheartening! Why, neither. No, there is nothing encouraging about it, and as for disheartening, nothing ought to dishearten a seaman. You never get disheartened or afraid in the woods, my friend." "I'll not say that. When the danger is great, it is my gift to see it, and know it, and try to avoid it, else would my scalp long since have been drying in a Mingo wigwam. On this lake, however, I can see no trail, and I feel it my duty to submit, though I think we ought to remember there is such a person as Mabel Dunham on board. But here comes her father, and he will naturally feel for his own child." "We are seriously situated, I believe, brother Cap," said the Sergeant, when he had reached the spot, "by what I can gather from the two hands on the forecastle?
They tell me the cutter cannot carry any more sail, and her drift is so great we shall go ashore in an hour or two. I hope their fears have deceived them?" Cap made no reply, but he gazed at the land with a rueful face, and then looked to windward with an expression of ferocity, as if he would gladly have quarrelled with the weather. "It may be well, brother," the Sergeant continued, "to send for Jasper, and consult him as to what is to be done. There are no French here to dread, and under all circumstances the boy will save us from drowning if possible." "Ay, ay, 'tis these cursed circumstances that have done all the mischief. But let the fellow come. Let him come. A few well managed questions will bring the truth out of him, I'll warrant you." This acquiescence on the part of the dogmatical Cap was no sooner obtained than Jasper was sent for. The young man instantly made his appearance, his whole air, countenance, and mien expressive of mortification, humility, and, as his observers fancied, rebuked deception. When he first stepped on deck, Jasper cast one hurried, anxious glance around, as if curious to know the situation of the cutter, and that glance sufficed, it would seem, to let him into the secret of all her perils. At first he looked to windward, as is usual with every seaman; then he turned round the horizon, until his eye caught a view of the high lands to leeward, when the whole truth burst upon him at once. "I've sent for you, Master Jasper," said Cap, folding his arms, and balancing his body with the dignity of the forecastle, "in order to learn something about the haven to leeward. We take it for granted you do not bear malice so hard as to wish to drown us all, especially the women, and I suppose you will be man enough to help us run the cutter into some safe berth until this bit of a gale has done blowing."
"I would die myself rather than harm should come to Mabel Dunham," the young man earnestly answered.
"I knew it! I knew it!" cried the Pathfinder, clapping his hand kindly on Jasper's shoulder. "The lad is as true as the best compass that ever ran a boundary, or brought a man off from a blind trail. It is a mortal sin to believe otherwise." "Humph!" ejaculated Cap. "Especially the women, as if they were in any particular danger. Never mind, young man, we shall understand each other by talking like two plain seamen. Do you know of any port under our lee?"
"None. There is a large bay at this end of the lake, but it is unknown to us all, and not easy of entrance."
"And this coast to leeward? It has nothing particular to recommend it, I suppose?"
"It is a wilderness until you reach the mouth of the Niagara in one direction, and Frontenac in the other. North and west, they tell me, there is nothing but forest and prairies for 1,000 miles."
"Thank God! Then there can be no French. Are there many savages hereaway on the land?"
"The Indians are to be found in all directions, though they are nowhere very numerous. By accident we might find a party at any point on the shore, or we might pass months there without seeing one."
"We must take our chance, then, as to the blackguards. But, to be frank with you, Master Western, if this little unpleasant matter about the French had not come to pass, what would you now do with the cutter?"
"I am a much younger sailor than yourself, Master Cap," said Jasper modestly, "and am hardly fitted to advise you."
"Ay, ay, we all know that. In a common case, perhaps not. But this is an uncommon case, and a circumstance, and on this bit of fresh water it has what might be called its peculiarities, and so, everything considered, you may be fitted to advise even your own father. At all events, you can speak, and I can judge of your opinions, agreeably to my own experience."
"I think, sir, before 2 hours are over, the cutter will have to anchor."
"Anchor? Not out here in the lake?"
"No, sir, but in yonder, near the land."
"You do not mean to say, Master Eau douce, you would anchor on a lee shore in a gale of wind?"
"If I would save my vessel, that is exactly what I would do, Master Cap."
"Whew! This is fresh water with a vengeance. Hark'ee, young man, I've been a seafaring animal, boy and man, 41 years, and I never yet heard of such a thing. I'd throw my ground tackle overboard before I would be guilty of so lubberly an act."
"That is what we do on this lake," modestly replied Jasper. when we are hard pressed. I dare say we might do better, had we been better taught."
"That you might, indeed. No man induces me to commit such a sin against my own bringing up. I should never dare show my face inside of Sandy Hook again, had I committed so know nothing an exploit. Why, Pathfinder here has more seamanship in him than that comes to. You can go below again, Master Eau douce."
Jasper quietly bowed and withdrew. Still, as he passed down the ladder, the spectators observed that he cast a lingering, anxious look at the horizon to windward and the land to leeward, and then disappeared with concern strongly expressed in every lineament of his face. End of chapter. Chapter 17 of The Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 17. His still refuted quirks he still repeats, new raised objections with new quibbles meets, till sinking in the quicksand he defends, he dies disputing, and the contest ends. Attributed to Cowper. As the soldier's wife was sick in her berth, Mabel Dunham was the only person in the outer cabin when Jasper returned to it, for, by an act of grace in the sergeant, he had been permitted to resume his proper place in this part of the vessel. We should be ascribing too much simplicity of character to our heroine if we said that she had felt no distrust of the young man in consequence of his arrest, but we should also be doing injustice to her warmth of feeling and generosity of disposition if we did not add that this distrust was insignificant and transient. As he now took his seat near her, his whole countenance clouded with the uneasiness he felt concerning the situation of the cutter, everything like suspicion was banished from her mind, and she saw in him only an injured man.
"You let this affair weigh too heavily on your mind, Jasper," said she eagerly, or with that forgetfulness of self with which the youthful of her sex are wont to betray their feelings when a strong and generous interest has attained the ascendancy. "No one who knows you can, or does, believe you guilty. Pathfinder says he will pledge his life for you." "Then you, Mabel," returned the youth, his eyes flashing fire, "do not look upon me as the traitor your father seems to believe me to be?" "My dear father is a soldier, and is obliged to act as one. My father's daughter is not, and will think of you as she ought to think of a man who has done so much to serve her already." "Mabel, I'm not used to talking with one like you, or saying all I think and feel with any. I never had a sister, and my mother died when I was a child, so that I know little what your sex most likes to hear."
Mabel would have given the world to know what lay behind the teeming word at which Jasper hesitated, but the indefinable and controlling sense of womanly diffidence made her suppress her curiosity. She waited in silence for him to explain his own meaning.
"I wish to say, Mabel,"
the young man continued, after a pause which he found sufficiently embarrassing,
"that I am unused to the ways and opinions of one like you, and that you must imagine all I would add."
Mabel had imagination enough to fancy anything, but there are ideas and feelings that her sex prefer to have expressed before they yield them all their own sympathies, and she had a vague consciousness that these of Jasper might properly be enumerated in the class. With a readiness that belonged to her sex, therefore, she preferred changing the discourse to permitting it to proceed any further in a manner so awkward and so unsatisfactory.
"Tell me one thing, Jasper, and I shall be content," said she, speaking now with a firmness which denoted confidence, not only in herself, but in her companion. "You do not deserve this cruel suspicion which rests upon you?" "I do not, Mabel!"
answered Jasper, looking into her full blue eyes with an openness and simplicity that might have shaken stronger distrust. "As I hope for mercy hereafter, I do not." "I knew it. I could have sworn it," returned the girl warmly. "And yet my father means well. But do not let this matter disturb you, Jasper." "There is so much more to apprehend from another quarter just now, that I scarcely think of it." "Jasper!" "I do not wish to alarm you, Mabel, but if your uncle could be persuaded to change his notions about handling the Scud, and yet he is so much more experienced than I am, that he ought perhaps to place more reliance on his own judgment than on mine." "Do you think the cutter in any danger?" demanded Mabel, quick as thought. "I fear so. At least she would have been thought in great danger by us of the lake. Perhaps an old seaman of the ocean may have means of his own to take care of her." "Jasper, all agree in giving you credit for skill in managing the Scud. You know the lake, you know the cutter. You must be the best judge of our real situation." "My concern for you, Mabel, may make me more cowardly than common; but, to be frank, I see but one method of keeping the cutter from being wrecked in the course of the next 2 or 3 hours, and that your uncle refuses to take. After all, this may be my ignorance, for, as he says, Ontario is merely fresh water." "You cannot believe this will make any difference. Think of my dear father, Jasper. Think of yourself, of all the lives that depend on a timely word from you to save them." "I think of you, Mabel, and that is more, much more, than all the rest put together," returned the young man, with a strength of expression and an earnestness of look that uttered infinitely more than the words themselves. Mabel's heart beat quickly, and a gleam of grateful satisfaction shot across her blushing features, but the alarm was too vivid and too serious to admit of much relief from happier thoughts. She did not attempt to repress a look of gratitude, and then she returned to the feeling which was naturally uppermost. "My uncle's obstinacy must not be permitted to occasion this disaster. Go once more on deck, Jasper, and ask my father to come into the cabin." While the young man was complying with this request, Mabel sat listening to the howling of the storm and the dashing of the water against the cutter, in a dread to which she had hitherto been a stranger. Constitutionally an excellent sailor, as the term is used among passengers, she had not hitherto bethought her of any danger, and had passed her time since the commencement of the gale in such womanly employments as her situation allowed. But now that alarm was seriously awakened, she did not fail to perceive that never before had she been on the water in such a tempest. The minute or two which elapsed before the Sergeant came appeared an hour, and she scarcely breathed when she saw him and Jasper descending the ladder in company. Quick as language could express her meaning, she acquainted her father with Jasper's opinion of their situation, and entreated him, if he loved her, or had any regard for his own life, or for those of his men, to interfere with her uncle, and to induce him to yield the control of the cutter again to its proper commander. "Jasper is true, father," added she earnestly, "and if false, he could have no motive in wrecking us in this distant part of the lake at the risk of all our lives, his own included. I will pledge my own life for his truth."
"Ay, this is well enough for a young woman who is frightened," answered the more phlegmatic parent, "but it might not be so excusable in one in command of an expedition. Jasper may think the chance of drowning and getting ashore fully repaid by the chance of escaping as soon as he reaches the land."
"Sergeant Dunham!"
"Father!" These exclamations were made simultaneously, but they were uttered in tones expressive of different feelings. In Jasper, surprise was the emotion uppermost; in Mabel, reproach. The old soldier, however, was too much accustomed to deal frankly with subordinates to heed either, and after a moment's thought, he continued as if neither had spoken.
"Nor is Brother Cap a man likely to submit to be taught his duty on board a vessel."
"But, father, when all our lives are in the utmost jeopardy—"
"So much the worse.
The fair weather commander is no great matter. It is when things go wrong that the best officer shows himself in his true colors. Charles Cap will not be likely to quit the helm because the ship is in danger. Besides, Jasper Eau douce, he says your proposal in itself has a suspicious air about it, and sounds more like treachery than reason."
"He may think so, but let him send for the pilot and hear his opinion. It is well known that I have not seen the man since yesterday evening."
"This does sound reasonably, and the experiment shall be tried. Follow me on deck, then, that all may be honest and above board."
Jasper obeyed, and so keen was the interest of Mabel that she too ventured as far as the companionway, where her garments were sufficiently protected against the violence of the wind, and her person from the spray. Here maiden modesty induced her to remain, though an absorbed witness of what was passing. The pilot soon appeared, and there was no mistaking the look of concern that he cast around at the scene as soon as he was in the open air. Some rumors of the situation of the Scud had found their way below, it is true, but in this instance rumor had lessened instead of magnifying the danger. He was allowed a few minutes to look about him, and then the question was put as to the course which he thought it prudent to follow.
"I see no means of saving the cutter but to anchor," he answered simply and without hesitation. "What! Out here in the lake?" inquired Cap, as he had previously done of Jasper. "No, but closer in, just at the outer line of the breakers." The effect of this communication was to leave no doubt in the mind of Cap that there was a secret arrangement between her commander and the pilot to cast away the Scud, most probably with the hope of effecting their escape. He consequently treated the opinion of the latter with the indifference he had manifested towards that of the former. "I tell you, brother Dunham," said he, in answer to the remonstrances of the Sergeant against his turning a deaf ear to this double representation, "that no seaman would give such an opinion honestly. To anchor on a lee shore in a gale of wind would be an act of madness that I could never excuse to the underwriters, under any circumstances, so long as a rag can be set; but to anchor close to breakers would be insanity."
"His Majesty underwrites the Scud, brother, and I am responsible for the lives of my command. These men are better acquainted with Lake Ontario than we can possibly be, and I do think their telling the same tale entitles them to some credit."
"Uncle,"
said Mabel earnestly, but a gesture from Jasper induced the girl to restrain her feelings.
"We are drifting down upon the breakers so rapidly," said the young man, "that little need be said on the subject. Half an hour must settle the matter, one way or the other. But I warn Master Cap that the surest footed man among us will not be able to keep his feet an instant on the deck of this low craft, should she fairly get within them. Indeed, I make little doubt that we shall fill and founder before the second line of rollers is passed."
"And how would anchoring help the matter?"
demanded Cap furiously, as if he felt that Jasper was responsible for the effects of the gale as well as for the opinion he had just given.
"It would at least do no harm," Eau douce mildly replied. "By bringing the cutter head to sea we should lessen her drift, and even if we dragged through the breakers, it would be with the least possible danger. I hope, Master Cap, you will allow the pilot and myself to prepare for anchoring, since the precaution may do good, and can do no harm."
"Overhaul your ranges, if you will, and get your anchors clear, with all my heart. We are now in a situation that cannot be much affected by anything of that sort. Sergeant, a word with you aft here, if you please."
Cap led his brother-in-law out of earshot, and then, with more of human feeling in his voice and manner than he was apt to exhibit, he opened his heart on the subject of their real situation.
"This is a melancholy affair for poor Mabel," said he, blowing his nose, and speaking with a slight tremor. "You and I, Sergeant, are old fellows, and used to being near death, if not to actually dying. Our trades fit us for such scenes, but poor Mabel! She is an affectionate and kind-hearted girl, and I had hoped to see her comfortably settled, and a mother before my time came. Well, well, we must take the bad with the good in every voyage, and the only serious objection that an old seafaring man can with propriety make to such an event is, that it should happen on this bit of damned fresh water."
Sergeant Dunham was a brave man, and had shown his spirit in scenes that looked much more appalling than this, but on all such occasions he had been able to act his part against his foes, while here he was pressed upon by an enemy whom he had no means of resisting. For himself he cared far less than for his daughter, feeling some of that self-reliance which seldom deserts a man of firmness who is in vigorous health, and who has been accustomed to personal exertions in moments of jeopardy. But as respects Mabel he saw no means of escape, and, with a father's fondness, he at once determined that, if either was doomed to perish, he and his daughter must perish together.
"Do you think this must come to pass?"
he asked of Cap firmly, but with strong feeling.
20 minutes will carry us into the breakers, and look for yourself, Sergeant. What chance will even the stoutest man among us have in that cauldron to leeward?"
The prospect was, indeed, little calculated to encourage hope. By this time the Scud was within a mile of the shore, on which the gale was blowing at right angles, with a violence that forbade the idea of showing any additional canvas with a view to claw off. The small portion of the mainsail actually set, and which merely served to keep the head of the Scud so near the wind as to prevent the waves from breaking over her, quivered under the gusts, as if at each moment the stout threads which held the complicated fabric together were about to be torn asunder. The drizzle had ceased, but the air, for 100 feet above the surface of the lake, was filled with dazzling spray, which had an appearance not unlike that of a brilliant mist, while above all the sun was shining gloriously in a cloudless sky. Jasper had noted the omen, and had foretold that it announced a speedy termination to the gale, though the next hour or two must decide their fate. Between the cutter and the shore the view was still more wild and appalling. The breakers extended nearly half a mile, while the water within their line was white with foam. The air above them was so far filled with vapor and spray as to render the land beyond hazy and distinct. Still, it could be seen that the latter was high, not a usual thing for the shores of Ontario, and that it was covered with the verdant mantle of the interminable forest. While the Sergeant and Cap were gazing at this scene in silence, Jasper and his people were actively engaged on the forecastle. No sooner had the young man received permission to resume his old employment than, appealing to some of the soldiers for aid, he mustered 5 or 6 assistants, and set about in earnest the performance of a duty which had been too long delayed. On these narrow waters, anchors are never stowed inboard, or cables that are intended for service unbent, and Jasper was saved much of the labor that would have been necessary in a vessel at sea. The 2 bowers were soon ready to be let go, ranges of the cables were overhauled, and then the party paused to look about them. No changes for the better had occurred, but the cutter was falling slowly in, and each instant rendered it more certain that she could not gain an inch to windward. One long, earnest survey of the lake ended, Jasper gave new orders in a similar manner to prove how much he thought that the time pressed. 2 kedges were got on deck, and hawsers were bent to them. The inner ends of the hawsers were bent, in their turns, to the crowns of the anchors, and everything was got ready to throw them overboard at the proper moment. These preparations completed, Jasper's manner changed from the excitement of exertion to a look of calm but settled concern. He quitted the forecastle, where the seas were dashing inboard at every plunge of the vessel, the duty just mentioned having been executed with the bodies of the crew frequently buried in the water, and walked to a drier part of the deck, aft. Here he was met by the Pathfinder, who was standing near Mabel and the quartermaster. Most of those on board, with the exception of the individuals who have already been particularly mentioned, were below, some seeking relief from physical suffering on their pallets, and others tardily bethinking them of their sins. For the first time, most probably, since her keel had dipped into the limpid waters of Ontario, the voice of prayer was heard on board the Scud. "Jasper," commenced his friend the guide, "I have been of no use this morning, for my gifts are of little account, as you know, in a vessel like this; but, should it please God to let the Sergeant's daughter reach the shore alive, my acquaintance with the forest may still carry her through in safety to the garrison."
"'Tis a fearful distance thither, Pathfinder," Mabel rejoined, the party being so near together that all which was said by one was overheard by the others. "I am afraid none of us could live to reach the fort."
"It would be a risky path, Mabel, and a crooked one, though some of your sex have undergone even more than that in this wilderness. But, Jasper, either you or I, or both of us, must man this bark canoe. Mabel's only chance will lie in getting through the breakers in that."
"I would willingly man anything to save Mabel," answered Jasper, with a melancholy smile; "but no human hand, Pathfinder, could carry that canoe through yonder breakers in a gale like this. I have hopes from anchoring, after all, for once before have we saved the Scud in an extremity nearly as great as this."
"If we are to anchor, Jasper," the Sergeant inquired, "why not do it at once? Every foot we lose in drifting now would come into the distance we shall probably drag when the anchors are let go."
Jasper drew nearer to the Sergeant, and took his hand, pressing it earnestly, and in a way to denote strong, almost uncontrollable feelings.
"Sergeant Dunham," said he, solemnly, "you are a good man, though you have treated me harshly in this business. You love your daughter?"
"That you cannot doubt, Eau douce,"
returned the Sergeant huskily.
"Will you give her, give us all, the only chance for life that is left?"
"What would you have me do, boy? What would you have me do? I have acted according to my judgment hitherto. What would you have me do?"
"Support me against Master Cap for 5 minutes, and all that man can do towards saving the Scud shall be done."
The Sergeant hesitated, for he was too much of a disciplinarian to fly in the face of regular orders. He disliked the appearance of vacillation, too, and then he had a profound respect for his kinsman's seamanship. While he was deliberating, Cap came from the post he had some time occupied, which was at the side of the man at the helm, and drew nigh the group. "Master Eau douce," said he, as soon as near enough to be heard, "I have come to inquire if you know any spot near by where this cutter can be beached. The moment has arrived when we are driven to this hard alternative." That instant of indecision on the part of Cap secured the triumph of Jasper. Looking at the Sergeant, the young man received a nod that assured him of all he asked, and he lost not one of those moments that were getting to be so very precious. "Shall I take the helm?" he inquired of Cap, "and see if we can reach a creek that lies to leeward?"
"Do so, do so,"
said the other, hemming to clear his throat, for he felt oppressed by a responsibility that weighed all the heavier on his shoulders on account of his ignorance. "Do so, Eau douce, since, to be frank with you, I can see nothing better to be done. We must beach or swamp." Jasper required no more. Springing aft, he soon had the tiller in his own hands. The pilot was prepared for what was to follow, and, at a sign from his young commander, the rag of sail that had so long been set was taken in. At that moment Jasper, watching his time, put the helm up. The head of a staysail was loosened forward, and the light cutter, as if conscious she was now under the control of familiar hands, fell off, and was soon in the trough of the sea. This perilous instant was passed in safety, and at the next moment the little vessel appeared flying down towards the breakers at a rate that threatened instant destruction. The distances had become so short that 5 or 6 minutes sufficed for all that Jasper wished, and he put the helm down again when the bows of the Scud came up to the wind, notwithstanding the turbulence of the waters, as gracefully as the duck varies its line of direction on the glassy pond. A sign from Jasper set all in motion on the forecastle, and a kedge was thrown from each bow. The fearful nature of the drift was now apparent even to Mabel's eyes, for the two hawsers ran out like tow lines. As soon as they straightened to a slight strain, both anchors were let go, and cable was given to each, nearly to the better ends.
It was not a difficult task to snub so light a craft with ground tackle of a quality better than common, and in less than 10 minutes from the moment when Jasper went to the helm, the Scud was riding, head to sea, with the two cables stretched ahead in lines that resembled bars of iron.
"This is not well done, Master Jasper!" angrily exclaimed Cap, as soon as he perceived the trick which had been played him. "This is not well done, sir. I order you to cut, and to beach the cutter without a moment's delay."
No one, however, seemed disposed to comply with this order, for so long as Eau douce saw fit to command, his own people were disposed to obey. Finding that the men remained passive, Cap, who believed they were in the utmost peril, turned fiercely to Jasper and renewed his remonstrances.
"You did not head for your pretended creek," added he, after dealing in some objurgatory remarks that we do not deem it necessary to record, "but steered for that bluff, where every soul on board would have been drowned had we gone ashore."
"And you wish to cut and put every soul ashore at that very spot?"
Jasper retorted, a little dryly.
"Throw a lead line overboard and ascertain the drift."
Cap now roared to the people forward. A sign from Jasper sustaining this order, it was instantly obeyed. All on deck watched, with nearly breathless interest, the result of the experiment. The lead was no sooner on the bottom than the line tended forward, and in about 2 minutes it was seen that the cutter had drifted her length dead in towards the bluff. Jasper looked gravely, for he well knew nothing would hold the vessel did she get within the vortex of the breakers, the first line of which was appearing and disappearing about a cable's length directly under her stern.
"Traitor!"
exclaimed Cap, shaking a finger at the young commander, though passion choked the rest.
"You must answer for this with your life," he added after a short pause. "If I were at the head of this expedition, Sergeant, I would hang him at the end of the main boom lest he escape drowning."
"Moderate your feelings, brother. Be more moderate, I beseech you. Jasper appears to have done all for the best, and matters may not be so bad as you believe them."
"Why did he not run for the creek he mentioned? Why has he brought us here, dead to windward of that bluff, and to a spot where even the breakers are only of half the ordinary width, as if in a hurry to drown all on board?"
"I headed for the bluff for the precise reason that the breakers are so narrow at this spot,"
answered Jasper mildly, though his gorge had risen at the language the other held.
"Do you mean to tell an old seaman like me that this cutter could live in those breakers?"
"I do not, sir. I think she would fill and swamp if driven into the first line of them. I am certain she would never reach the shore on her bottom, if fairly entered. I hope to keep her clear of them altogether."
"With a drift of her length in a minute?"
"The backing of the answers does not yet fairly tell, nor do I even hope that they will entirely bring her up."
"On what, then, do you rely? To moor a craft head and stern by faith, hope, and charity?"
"No, sir. I trust to the undertow. I headed for the bluff because I knew that it was stronger at that point than at any other, and because we could get nearer in with the land without entering the breakers."
This was said with spirit, though without any particular show of resentment. Its effect on Cap was marked, the feeling that was uppermost being evidently that of surprise.
"Undertow!" he repeated. "Who the devil ever heard of saving a vessel from going ashore by the undertow?"
"This may never happen on the ocean, sir," Jasper answered modestly, "but we have known it to happen here."
"The lad is right, brother," put in the sergeant; "for though I do not well understand it, I have often heard the sailors of the lake speak of such a thing. We shall do well to trust to Jasper in this strait."
Cap grumbled and swore, but as there was no remedy, he was compelled to acquiesce. Jasper, being now called on to explain what he meant by the undertow, gave this account of the matter. The water that was driven up on the shore by the gale was necessarily compelled to find its level by returning to the lake by some secret channels. This could not be done on the surface, where both wind and waves were constantly urging it towards the land, and it necessarily formed a sort of lower eddy, by means of which it flowed back again to its ancient and proper bed. This inferior current had received the name of the undertow, and as it would necessarily act on the bottom of a vessel which drew as much water as the Scud, Jasper trusted to the aid of this reaction to keep his cables from parting. In short, the upper and lower currents would, in a manner, counteract each other. Simple and ingenious as was this theory, however, as yet there was little evidence of its being reduced to practice. The drift continued, though, as the kedges and hawsers with which the anchors were backed took the strains, it became sensibly less. At length the man at the lead announced the joyful intelligence that the anchors had ceased to drag, and that the vessel had brought up. At this precise moment the first line of breakers was about 100 feet astern of the Scud, even appearing to approach much nearer as the foam vanished and returned on the raging surges. Jasper sprang forward, and casting a glance over the bows, he smiled in triumph as he pointed exultingly to the cables. Instead of resembling bars of iron in rigidity, as before, they were curving downwards, and to a seaman's senses it was evident that the cutter rose and fell on the seas as they came in with the ease of a ship in a tidesway, when the power of the wind is relieved by the counteracting pressure of the water. "'Tis the undertow!" he exclaimed with delight, fairly bounding along the deck to steady the helm, in order that the cutter might ride still easier. "Providence has placed us directly in its current, and there is no longer any danger." "Ay, ay, Providence is a good seaman," growled Cap, "and often helps lubbers out of difficulty. Undertow or upper tow, the gale has abated, and fortunately for us all, the anchors have met with good holding ground. Then this damned fresh water has an unnatural way with it." Men are seldom inclined to quarrel with good fortune, but it is in distress that they grow clamorous and critical. Most on board were disposed to believe that they had been saved from shipwreck by the skill and knowledge of Jasper, without regarding the opinions of Cap, whose remarks were now little heeded. There was half an hour of uncertainty and doubt, it is true, during which period the lead was anxiously watched, and then a feeling of security came over all, and the weary slept without dreaming of instant death. End of chapter. Chapter 18 of the Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 18. It is to be all made of sighs and tears. It is to be all made of faith and service. It is to be all made of fantasy, all made of passion, and all made of wishes, all adoration, duty, and observance, all humbleness, all patience and impatience, all purity, all trial, all observance. Attributed to Shakespeare. It was near noon when the gale broke, and then its force abated as suddenly as its violence had arisen. In less than 2 hours after the wind fell, the surface of the lake, though still agitated, was no longer glittering with foam, and in double that time the entire sheet presented the ordinary scene of disturbed water that was unbroken by the violence of a tempest. Still the waves came rolling incessantly towards the shore, and the lines of breakers remained, though the spray had ceased to fly. The combing of the swells was more moderate, and all that there was of violence proceeded from the impulsion of wind which had abated. As it was impossible to make head against the sea that was still up, with the light opposing air that blew from the eastward, all thoughts of getting under way that afternoon were abandoned. Jasper, who had now quietly resumed the command of the Scud, busied himself, however, in heaving up the anchors, which were lifted in succession. The kedges that backed them were weighed, and everything was got in readiness for a prompt departure, as soon as the state of the weather would allow. In the meantime, they who had no concern with these duties sought such means of amusement as their peculiar circumstances allowed. As is common with those who are unused to the confinement of a vessel, Mabel cast wistful eyes towards the shore, nor was it long before she expressed a wish that it were possible to land. The Pathfinder was near her at the time, and he assured her that nothing would be easier, as they had a bark canoe on deck, which was the best possible mode of conveyance to go through a surf. After the usual doubts and misgivings, the Sergeant was appealed to. His opinion proved to be favorable, and preparations to carry the whim into effect were immediately made. The party which was to land consisted of Sergeant Dunham, his daughter, and the Pathfinder. Accustomed to the canoe, Mabel took her seat in the centre with great steadiness. Her father was placed in the bows, while the guide assumed the office of conductor, by steering in the stern. There was little need of impelling the canoe by means of the paddle, for the rollers sent it forward at moments with a violence that set every effort to govern its movements at defiance. More than once, before the shore was reached, Mabel repented of her temerity, but Pathfinder encouraged her, and really manifested so much self-possession, coolness, and strength of arm himself, that even a female might have hesitated about owning all her apprehensions. Our heroine was no coward, and while she felt the novelty of her situation, in landing through a surf, she also experienced a fair proportion of its wild delight. At moments, indeed, her heart was in her mouth, as the bubble of a boat floated on the very crest of a foaming breaker, appearing to skim the water like a swallow, and then she flushed and laughed, as, left by the glancing element, they appeared to linger behind as if ashamed of having been outdone in the headlong race. A few minutes sufficed for this excitement, for though the distance between the cutter and the land considerably exceeded a quarter of a mile, the intermediate space was passed in a very few minutes. On landing, the Sergeant kissed his daughter kindly, for he was so much of a soldier as always to feel more at home on terra firma than when afloat, and, taking his gun, he announced his intention to pass an hour in quest of game.
Pathfinder will remain near you, girl, and no doubt he will tell you some of the traditions of this part of the world, or some of his own experiences with the Mingos.
The guide laughed, promised to have a care of Mabel, and in a few minutes the father had ascended a steep acclivity and disappeared in the forest. The others took another direction, which, after a few minutes of a sharp ascent also, brought them to a small naked point on the promontory, where the eye overlooked an extensive and very peculiar panorama. Here Mabel seated herself on a fragment of fallen rock to recover her breath and strength, while her companion, on whose sinews no personal exertion seemed to make any impression, stood at her side, leaning in his own and not ungraceful manner on his long rifle. Several minutes passed, and neither spoke, Mabel in particular being lost in admiration of the view. The position the two had obtained was sufficiently elevated to command a wide reach of the lake, which stretched away towards the northeast in a boundless sheet, glittering beneath the rays of an afternoon sun, and yet betraying the remains of that agitation which it had endured while tossed by the late tempest. The land set bounds to its limits in a huge crescent, disappearing in distance towards the southeast and the north. Far as the eye could reach, nothing but forest was visible, not even a solitary sign of civilization breaking in upon the uniform and grand magnificence of nature. The gale had driven the Scud beyond the line of those forts with which the French were then endeavoring to gird the English North American possessions, for, following the channels of communications between the great lakes, their posts were on the banks of the Niagara, while our adventurers had reached a point many leagues westward of that celebrated strait. The cutter rode at single anchor, without the breakers, resembling some well-imagined and accurately executed toy, intended rather for a glass case than for struggles with the elements which he had so lately gone through, while the canoe lay on a narrow beach, just out of reach of the waves that came booming upon the land, a speck upon the shingles. "We are very far here from human habitations," exclaimed Mabel, when, after a long survey of the scene, its principal peculiarities forced themselves on her active and ever brilliant imagination. "This is indeed being on a frontier." "Have they more sightly scenes than this nearer the sea and around their large towns?" demanded Pathfinder, with an interest he was apt to discover in such a subject. "I will not say that. There is more to remind one of his fellow beings there than here; less, perhaps, to remind one of God." "Ay, Mabel, that is what my own feelings say. I am but a poor hunter, I know, untaught and unlarned; but God is as near me in this my home as he is near the king in his royal palace." "Who can doubt it?" returned Mabel, looking from the view up into the hard-featured but honest face of her companion, though not without surprise at the energy of his manner. "One feels nearer to God in such a spot, I think, than when the mind is distracted by the objects of the towns." "You say all I wish to say myself, Mabel, but in so much plainer speech that you make me ashamed of wishing to let others know what I feel on such matters. I have coasted this lake in search of skins afore the war, and have been here already, not at this very spot, for we landed yonder, where you may see the blasted oak that stands above the cluster of hemlocks." "How, Pathfinder, can you remember all these trifles so accurately?" "These are our streets and houses, our churches and palaces. Remember them, indeed! I once made an appointment with the Big Sarpent, to meet at 12 o'clock at noon, near the foot of a certain pine, at the end of 6 months, when neither of us was within 300 miles of the spot. The tree stood and stands still, unless the judgment of Providence has lighted on that too, in the midst of the forest, 50 miles from any settlement, but in a most extraordinary neighborhood for beaver." "And did you meet at that very spot an hour?" "Does the sun rise and set? When I reached the tree, I found the Sarpent leaning against its trunk with torn leggings and muddied moccasins. The Delaware had got into a swamp, and it worried him not a little to find his way out of it; but as the sun which comes over the eastern hills in the morning goes down behind the western at night, so was he true to time and place. No fear of Chingachgook when there is either a friend or an enemy in the case. He is equally sartain with each." "And where is the Delaware now? Why is he not here with us to-day?" "He is scouting on the Mingo trail, where I ought to have been too, but for a great human infirmity." "You seem above, beyond, superior to all infirmity, Pathfinder. I never yet met with a man who appeared to be so little liable to the weaknesses of nature." "If you mean in the way of health and strength, Mabel, Providence has been kind to me, though I fancy the open air, long hunts, active scoutings, forest fare, and the sleep of a good conscience may always keep the doctors at a distance. But I'm human after all. Yes, I find I'm very human in some of my feelings." Mabel looked surprised, and it would be no more than delineating the character of her sex if we added that her sweet countenance expressed a good deal of curiosity too, though her tongue was more discreet. "There is something bewitching in this wild life of yours, Pathfinder," she exclaimed, a tinge of enthusiasm mantling her cheeks. "I find I'm fast getting to be a frontier girl, and am coming to love all this grand silence of the woods. The towns seem tame to me, and as my father will probably pass the remainder of his days here, where he has already lived so long, I begin to feel that I should be happy to continue with him, and not to return to the seashore." "The woods are never silent, Mabel, to such as understand their meaning. Days at a time have I travelled them alone, without feeling the want of company; and as for conversation, for such as can comprehend their language, there is no want of rational and instructive discourse." "I believe you are happier when alone, Pathfinder, than when mingling with your fellow creatures." "I will not say that. I will not say exactly that. I have seen the time when I have thought that God was sufficient for me in the forest, and that I have craved no more than his bounty and his care. But other feelings have got uppermost, and I suppose nature will have its way. All other creatures mate, Mabel, and it was intended man should do so too." "And have you never bethought you of seeking a wife, Pathfinder, to share your fortunes?" inquired the girl,
with the directness and simplicity that the pure of heart and the undesigning are the most apt to manifest, and with that feeling of affection which is inbred in her sex. To me it seems you only want a home to return to from your wanderings to render your life completely happy. Were I a man, it would be my delight to roam through these forests at will, or to sail over this beautiful lake."
"I understand you, Mabel, and God bless you for thinking of the welfare of men as humble as we are. We have our pleasures, it is true, as well as our gifts, but we might be happier. Yes, I do think we might be happier."
"Happier? In what way, Pathfinder? In this pure air, with these cool and shaded forests to wander through, this lovely lake to gaze at and sail upon, with clear consciences and abundance for all their real wants, men ought to be nothing less than perfectly happy, as their infirmities will allow."
"Every creature has its gifts, Mabel, and men have theirs," answered the guide, looking stealthily at his beautiful companion, whose cheeks had flushed and eyes brightened under the ardor of feelings excited by the novelty of her striking situation. "And all must obey them. Do you see yonder pigeon that is just alighting on the beach, here in a line with the fallen chestnut?"
"Certainly. It is the only thing stirring with life in it, besides ourselves, that is to be seen in this vast solitude."
"Not so, Mabel, not so. Providence makes nothing that lives to live quite alone. Here is its mate, just rising on the wing. It has been feeding near the other beach, but it will not long be separated from its companion."
"I understand you, Pathfinder," returned Mabel, smiling sweetly, though as calmly as if the discourse was with her father. "But a hunter may find a mate, even in this wild region. The Indian girls are affectionate and true, I know, for such was the wife of Arrowhead, to a husband who oftener frowned than smiled."
"That would never do, Mabel, and good would never come of it. Kind must cling to kind, and country to country, if one would find happiness. If, indeed, I could meet with one like you, who would consent to be a hunter's wife, and who would not scorn my ignorance and rudeness, then, indeed, would all the toil of the past appear like the sporting of the young deer, and all the future like sunshine."
"One like me, a girl of my years and indiscretion, would hardly make a fit companion for the boldest scout and surest hunter on the lines."
"Ah, Mabel, I fear me that I have been improving a redskin's gifts with a paleface's nature. Such a character would ensure a wife in an Indian village."
Surely, surely, Pathfinder, you would not think of choosing one so ignorant, so frivolous, so vain, and so inexperienced as I for your wife." Mabel would have added, "and as young," but an instinctive feeling of delicacy repressed the words.
"And why not, Mabel? If you are ignorant of frontier usages, you know more than all of us of pleasant anecdotes and town customs. As for frivolous, I know not what it means; but if it signifies beauty, ah's me, I fear it is no fault in my eyes. Vain you are not, as is seen by the kind manner in which you listen to all my idle tales about scoutings and trails; and as for experience, that will come with years. Besides, Mabel, I fear men think little of these matters when they are about to take wives. I do."
"Pathfinder, your words, your looks, surely all this is meant in trifling? You speak in pleasantry?"
"To me it is always agreeable to be near you, Mabel, and I should sleep sounder this blessed night than I have done for a week past, could I think that you find such discourse as pleasant as I do." We shall not say that Mabel Dunham had not believed herself a favorite with the guide. This her quick feminine sagacity had early discovered, and perhaps she had occasionally thought there had mingled with his regard and friendship some of that manly tenderness which the ruder sex must be coarse indeed not to show on occasions to the gentler. But the idea that he seriously sought her for his wife had never before crossed the mind of the spirited and ingenuous girl. Now, however, a gleam of something like the truth, broke in upon her imagination, less induced by the words of her companion, perhaps, than by his manner. Looking earnestly into the rugged, honest countenance of the scout, Mabel's own features became concerned and grave, and when she spoke again it was with a gentleness of manner that attracted him to her even more powerfully than the words themselves were calculated to repel. "You and I should understand each other, Pathfinder," said she with an earnest sincerity, "nor should there be any cloud between us. You are too upright and frank to meet with anything but sincerity and frankness in return. Surely all this means nothing, has no other connection with your feelings than such a friendship as one of your wisdom and character would naturally feel for a girl like me?" "I believe it's all natural, Mabel. Yes, I do. The Sergeant tells me he had such feelings towards your own mother, and I think I've seen something like it in the young people I have from time to time guided through the wilderness. Yes, I dare say it's all natural enough, and that makes it come so easy, and is a great comfort to me." "Pathfinder, your words make me uneasy. Speak plainer, or change the subject for ever. You cannot mean that. You cannot wish me to understand." Even the tongue of the spirited Mabel faltered, and she shrank with maiden shame from adding what she wished so earnestly to say. Rallying her courage, however, and determined to know all as soon and as plainly as possible, after a moment's hesitation she continued, "I mean, Pathfinder, that you do not wish me to understand, that you seriously think of me as a wife?" "I do, Mabel. That's it. That's just it. And you have put the matter in a much better point of view than I with my forest gifts and frontier ways would ever be able to do. The Sergeant and I have concluded on the matter, if it is agreeable to you, as he thinks is likely to be the case, though I doubt my own power to please one who deserves the best husband America can produce." Mabel's countenance changed from uneasiness to surprise, and then, by a transition still quicker, from surprise to pain. "My father!" she exclaimed. "My dear father has thought of my becoming your wife, Pathfinder?" "Yes, he has, Mabel, he has indeed. He has even thought such a thing might be agreeable to you, and has almost encouraged me to fancy it might be true." "But you yourself, you certainly can care nothing whether this singular expectation shall ever be realized or not." "Anan?" "I mean, Pathfinder, that you have talked of this match more to oblige my father than anything else, that your feelings are no way concerned, let my answer be what it may?" The scout looked earnestly into the beautiful face of Mabel, which had flushed with the ardor and novelty of her sensations, and it was not possible to mistake the intense admiration that betrayed itself in every lineament of his ingenuous countenance. "I have often thought myself happy, Mabel, when ranging the woods on a successful hunt, breathing the pure air of the hills, and filled with vigor and health; but I now know that it has all been idleness and vanity compared with the delight it would give me to know that you thought better of me than you think of most others." "Better of you! I do, indeed, think better of you, Pathfinder, than of most others. I am not certain that I do not think better of you than of any other, for your truth, honesty, simplicity, justice, and courage are scarcely equaled by any of earth." "Ah, Mabel, these are sweet and encouraging words from you, and the Sergeant, after all, was not so near wrong as I feared." "Nay, Pathfinder, in the name of all that is sacred and just, do not let us misunderstand each other in a matter of so much importance. While I esteem, respect, nay, reverence you, almost as much as I reverence my own dear father, it is impossible that I should ever become your wife, that I—" The change in her companion's countenance was so sudden and so great that the moment the effect of what she had uttered became visible in the face of the Pathfinder, Mabel arrested her own words, notwithstanding her strong desire to be explicit, the reluctance with which she could at any time cause pain being sufficient of itself to induce the pause. Neither spoke for some time, the shade of disappointment that crossed the rugged lineaments of the hunter amounting so nearly to anguish as to frighten his companion, while the sensation of choking became so strong in the Pathfinder that he fairly griped his throat, like one who sought physical relief for physical suffering. The convulsive manner in which his fingers worked actually struck the alarmed girl with a feeling of awe. "Nay, Pathfinder," Mabel eagerly added, the instant she could command her voice, "I may have said more than I mean, for all things of this nature are possible, and women, they say, are never sure of their own minds. What I wish you to understand is, that it is not likely that you and I should ever think of each other as man and wife ought to think of each other." "I do not, I shall never think in that way again, Mabel," gasped forth the Pathfinder, who appeared to utter his words like one just raised above the pressure of some suffocating substance. "No, no, I shall never think of you or any one else again in that way." "Pathfinder, dear Pathfinder, understand me. Do not attach more meaning to my words than I do myself. A match like that would be unwise, unnatural, perhaps." "Yes, unnatural, again nature. And so I told the Sergeant, but he would have it otherwise." "Pathfinder, oh, this is worse than I could have imagined. Take my hand, excellent Pathfinder, and let me see that you do not hate me. For God's sake, smile upon me again." "Hate you, Mabel? Smile upon you? Ah's me!" "Nay, give me your hand, your hearty, true, and manly hand. Both, Pathfinder, for I shall not be easy until I feel certain that we are friends again, and that all this has been a mistake." "Mabel," said the guide, looking wistfully into the face of the generous and impetuous girl, as she held his two hard and sunburnt hands in her own pretty and delicate fingers, and laughing in his own silent and peculiar manner, while anguish gleamed over lineaments which seemed incapable of deception, even while agitated with emotions so conflicting. "Mabel, the Sergeant was wrong." The pent-up feelings could endure no more, and the tears rolled down the cheeks of the scout like rain. His fingers again worked convulsively at his throat, and his breast heaved, as if it possessed a tenet of which it would be rid by any effort, however desperate.
"Pathfinder, Pathfinder!" Mabel almost shrieked. "Anything but this! Anything but this! Speak to me, Pathfinder! Smile again, say one kind word, anything to prove you can forgive me."
"The Sergeant was wrong!" exclaimed the guide, laughing amid his agony, in a way to terrify his companion by the unnatural mixture of anguish and light-heartedness.
I knew it, and said it. Yes, the Sergeant was wrong after all." "We can be friends, though we cannot be man and wife," continued Mabel, almost as much disturbed as her companion, scarcely knowing what she said. "We can always be friends, and always will."
"I thought the Sergeant was mistaken," resumed the Pathfinder, when a great effort had enabled him to command himself, "for I did not think my gifts were such as would please the fancy of a town-bred girl. It would have been better, Mabel, had he not over-persuaded me into a different notion, and it might have been better, too, had you not been so pleasant and confiding-like. Yes, it would."
"If I thought any error of mine had raised false expectations in you, Pathfinder, however unintentionally on my part, I should never forgive myself; for, believe me, I would rather endure pain in my own feelings than you should suffer."
"That's just it, Mabel, that's just it. These speeches and opinions, spoken in so soft a voice, and in a way I'm so unused to in the woods, have done the mischief. But I now see plainly and begin to understand the difference between us better, and will strive to keep down thought, and to go abroad again as I used to do, looking for the game and the enemy. Ah's me, Mabel, I have indeed been on a false trail since we met."
"In a little while you will forget all this, and think of me as a friend, who owes you her life."
"This may be the way in the towns, but I doubt if it's natural to the woods. With us, when the eye sees a lovely sight, it is apt to keep it long in view; or when the mind takes in an upright and proper feeling, it is loath to part with it."
"You will forget it all, when you come seriously to recollect that I am altogether unsuited to be your wife."
"So I told the Sergeant, but he would have it otherwise. I knew you was too young and beautiful for one of middle age, like myself, and who never was comely to look at even in youth; and then your ways have not been my ways, nor would a hunter's cabin be a fitting place for one who was educated among chiefs, as it were. If I were younger and comelier, though, like Jasper Eau douce—" "Never mind Jasper Eau douce," interrupted Mabel impatiently. "We can talk of something else." "Jasper is a worthy lad, Mabel, ay, and a comely," returned the guileless guide, looking earnestly at the girl, as if he distrusted her judgment in speaking slightingly of his friend. "Were I only half as comely as Jasper Western, my misgivings in this affair would not have been so great, and they might not have been so true."
"We will not talk of Jasper Western," repeated Mabel, the color mounting to her temples. "He may be good enough in a gale or on the lake, but he is not good enough to talk of here."
"I fear me, Mabel, he is better than the man who is likely to be your husband, though the Sergeant says that can never take place. But the Sergeant was wrong once, and he may be wrong twice."
"And who is likely to be my husband, Pathfinder? This is scarcely less strange than what has just passed between us."
"I know it is natural for like to seek like, and for them that have consorted much with officers' ladies to wish to be officers' ladies themselves. But, Mabel, I may speak plainly to you, I know, and I hope my words will not give you pain; for, now I understand what is to be disappointed in such feelings, I wouldn't wish to cause even a Mingo sorrow on this head. But happiness is not always to be found in a marquee, any more than in a tent; and though the officers' quarters may look more tempting than the rest of the barracks, there is often great misery between husband and wife inside of their doors."
"I do not doubt it in the least, Pathfinder; and did it rest with me to decide, I would sooner follow you to some cabin in the woods and share your fortune, though it might be better or worse, than go inside the door of any officer I know, with an intention of remaining there as its master's wife."
"Mabel, this is not what Lundie hopes, or Lundie thinks."
"And what care I for Lundie? He is major of the 55th, and may command his men to wheel and march about as he pleases, but he cannot compel me to wed the greatest or the meanest of his mess. Besides, what can you know of Lundie's wishes on such a subject?"
"From Lundie's own mouth. The Sergeant had told him that he wished me for a son-in-law, and the Major, being an old and a true friend, conversed with me on the subject. He put it to me plainly, whether it would not be more generous in me to let an officer succeed, than to strive to make you share a hunter's fortune. I owned the truth, I did, and that was, that I thought it might; but when he told me that the quartermaster would be his choice, I would not abide by the conditions. No, no, Mabel, I know Davy Muir well, and though he may make you a lady, he can never make you a happy woman, or himself a gentleman."
"My father has been very wrong if he has said or done aught to cause you sorrow, Pathfinder, and so great is my respect for you, so sincere my friendship, that were it not for one, I mean that no person need fear Lieutenant Muir's influence with me, I would rather remain as I am to my dying day than become a lady at the cost of being his wife."
"I do not think you would say that which you do not feel, Mabel," returned Pathfinder earnestly. "Not at such a moment, on such a subject, and least of all to you. No, Lieutenant Muir may find wives where he can. My name shall never be on his catalogue." Thank you for that, Mabel; for though there is no longer any hope for me, I could never be happy were you to take to the quartermaster. I feared the commission might count for something, I did, and I know the man. It is not jealousy that makes me speak in this manner, but truth, for I know the man. Now, were you to fancy a deserving youth, one like Jasper Western, for instance—" "Why always mention Jasper Eau douce, Pathfinder? He can have no concern with our friendship. Let us talk of yourself, and of the manner in which you intend to pass the winter." "Ah's me! I'm little worth at the best, Mabel, unless it may be on a trail or with the rifle, and less worth now that I have discovered the Sergeant's mistake. There is no need, therefore, of talking of me. It has been very pleasant to me to be near you so long, and even to fancy that the Sergeant was right; but that is all over now. I shall go down the lake with Jasper, and then there will be business to occupy us, and that will keep useless thoughts out of the mind." "And you will forget me. No, not forget me either, Pathfinder, but you will resume your old pursuits, and cease to think a girl of sufficient importance to disturb your peace?" "I never knowed it afore, Mabel, but girls are of more account in this life than I could have believed. Now, afore I knowed you, the new-born babe did not sleep more sweetly than I used. My head was no sooner on the root or the stone, or mayhap on the skin, than all was lost to the senses, unless it might be to go over in the night the business of the day in a dream like, and there I lay till the moment came to be stirring, and the swallows were not more certain to be on the wing with the light than I to be afoot at the moment I wished to be. All this seemed a gift, and might be calculated on even in the midst of a Mingo camp, for I've been outlying in my time in the very villages of the vagabonds." "And all this will return to you, Pathfinder, for one so upright and sincere will never waste his happiness on a mere fancy. You will dream again of your hunts, of the deer you have slain, and of the beaver you have taken." "Ah's me, Mabel! I wish never to dream again. Before we met, I had a sort of pleasure in following up the hounds, in fancy as it might be, and even in striking a trail of the Iroquois. Nay, I've been in scrimmages and ambushments, in thought like, and found satisfaction in it, according to my gifts; but all these things have lost their charms since I made acquaintance with you. Now, I think no longer of anything rude in my dreams, but the very last night we stayed in the garrison I imagined I had a cabin in a grove of sugar maples, and at the root of every tree was a Mabel Dunham, while the birds among the branches sang ballads instead of the notes that nature gave, and even the deer stopped to listen. I tried to shoot a fawn, but Killdeer missed fire, and the creature laughed in my face, as pleasantly as a young girl laughs in her merriment, and then it bounded away, looking back as if expecting me to follow." "No more of this, Pathfinder; we'll talk no more of these things," said Mabel, dashing the tears from her eyes, for the simple, earnest manner in which this hardy woodsman betrayed the deep hold she had taken of his feelings nearly proved too much for her own generous heart. "Now let us look for my father. He cannot be distant, as I heard his gun quite near." The Sergeant was wrong. Yes, he was wrong, and it's of no avail to attempt to make the dove consort with the wolf. "Here comes my dear father," interrupted Mabel. "Let us look cheerful and happy, Pathfinder, as such good friends ought to look, and keep each other's secrets." A pause succeeded. The Sergeant's foot was heard crushing the dried twigs hard by, and then his form appeared shoving aside the bushes of a copse just near. As he issued into the open ground, the old soldier scrutinized his daughter and her companion, and, speaking good-naturedly, he said, "Mabel, child, you are young and light of foot. Look for a bird that I've shot that fell just beyond the thicket of young hemlocks on the shore.
and as Jasper is showing signs of an intention of getting under way, you need not take the trouble to clamber up this hill again, but we will meet you on the beach in a few minutes."
Mabel obeyed, bounding down the hill with the elastic step of youth and health. But, notwithstanding the lightness of her steps, the heart of the girl was heavy, and no sooner was she hid from observation by the thicket than she threw herself on the root of a tree and wept as if her heart would break. The sergeant watched her until she disappeared, with a father's pride, and then turned to his companion with a smile as kind and as familiar as his habits would allow him to use towards any.
"She has her mother's lightness and activity, my friend, with somewhat of her father's force," said he. "Her mother was not quite so handsome, I think myself, but the Dunhams were always thought comely, whether men or women. Well, Pathfinder, I take it for granted you've not overlooked the opportunity, but have spoken plainly to the girl? Women like frankness in matters of this sort."
"I believe Mabel and I understand each other at last, Sergeant," returned the other, looking another way to avoid the soldier's face.
"So much the better. Some people fancy that a little doubt and uncertainty makes love all the livelier, but I am one of those who think the plainer the tongue speaks, the easier the mind will comprehend. Was Mabel surprised?"
"I fear she was, Sergeant. I fear she was taken quite by surprise. Yes, I do."
"Well, well, surprises in love are like an ambush in war, and quite as lawful, though it is not so easy to tell when a woman is surprised as to tell when it happens to an enemy. Mabel did not run away, my worthy friend, did she?"
"No, Sergeant, Mabel did not try to escape. That I can say with a clear conscience."
"I hope the girl was too willing neither. Her mother was shy and coy for a month at least, but frankness, after all, is a recommendation in a man or woman."
That it is, and judgment too."
"You are not to look for too much judgment in a young creature of 20, Pathfinder, but it will come with experience. A mistake in you or me, for instance, might not be so easily overlooked. But in a girl of Mabel's years, one is not to strain at a gnat lest they swallow a camel."
The reader will remember that Sergeant Dunham was not a Hebrew scholar. The muscles of the listener's face twitched as the sergeant was thus delivering his sentiments, though the former had now recovered a portion of that stoicism which formed so large a part of his character, and which he had probably imbibed from long association with the Indians. His eyes rose and fell, and once a gleam shot athwart his hard features as if he were about to indulge in his peculiar laugh. But the joyous feeling, if it really existed, was as quickly lost in a look allied to anguish. It was this unusual mixture of wild and keen mental agony with native simple joyousness which had most struck Mabel, who, in the interview just related, had a dozen times been on the point of believing that her suitor's heart was only lightly touched, as images of happiness and humor gleamed over a mind that was almost infantile in its simplicity and nature. An impression, however, which was soon driven away by the discovery of emotions so painful and so deep that they seemed to harrow the very soul. "You say true, Sergeant," Pathfinder answered. "A mistake in one like you is a more serious matter."
"You will find Mabel sincere and honest in the end. Give her but a little time."
"Ah's me, Sergeant."
"A man of your merits would make an impression on a rock. Give him time, Pathfinder."
"Sergeant Dunham, we are old fellow campaigners. That is, as campaigns are carried on here in the wilderness, and we have done so many kind acts to each other that we can afford to be candid. What has caused you to believe that a girl like Mabel could ever fancy one so rude as I am?"
"What? Why, a variety of reasons, and good reasons too, my friend. These same acts of kindness, perhaps, and the campaigns you mention. Moreover, you are my sworn and tried comrade."
"All this sounds well, so far as you and I are concerned, but they do not touch the case of your pretty daughter.
She may think these very campaigns have destroyed the little comeliness I may once have had, and I am not quite certain that being an old friend of her father would lead any young maiden's mind into a particular affection for a suitor. Like loves like, I tell you, Sergeant, and my gifts are not altogether the gifts of Mabel Dunham."
"These are some of your old modest qualms, Pathfinder, and will do you no credit with the girl. Women distrust men who distrust themselves, and take to men who distrust nothing. Modesty is a capital thing in a recruit, I grant you, or in a young subaltern who has just joined, for it prevents his railing at the non-commissioned officers before he knows what is to rail at. I'm not sure it is out of place in a commissary or a parson, but it's the devil and all when it gets possession of a real soldier or a lover. Have as little to do with it as possible, if you would win a woman's heart. As for your doctrine that like loves like, it is as wrong as possible in matters of this sort. If like loved like, women would love one another, and men also. No, like loves dislike." The sergeant was merely a scholar of the camp. "And you have nothing to fear from Mabel on that score. Look at Lieutenant Muir. The man has had 5 wives already, they tell me, and there is no more modesty in him than there is in a cat o' nine tails."
"Lieutenant Muir will never be the husband of Mabel Dunham, let him ruffle his feathers as much as he may."
"That is a sensible remark of yours, Pathfinder, for my mind is made up that you shall be my son-in-law. If I were an officer myself, Mr. Muir might have some chance, but time has placed one door between my child and myself, and I don't intend there shall be that of a marquis also."
"Sergeant, we must let Mabel follow her own fancy. She is young and light of heart, and God forbid that any wish of mine should lay the weight of a feather on a mind that is all gaiety now, or take one note of happiness from her laughter."
"Have you conversed freely with the girl?"
the sergeant demanded quickly, and with some asperity of manner. Pathfinder was too honest to deny a truth plain as that which the answer required, and yet too honorable to betray Mabel, and expose her to the resentment of one whom he well knew to be stern in his anger. "We have laid open our minds," he said, "and though Mabel's is one that any man might love to look at, I find little there, Sergeant, to make me think any better of myself."
"The girl has not dared to refuse you, to refuse her father's best friend."
Pathfinder turned his face away to conceal the look of anguish that consciousness told him was passing athwart it, but he continued the discourse in his own quiet, manly tones. "Mabel is too kind to refuse anything, or to utter harsh words to a dog. I have not put the question in a way to be downright refused, Sergeant."
"And did you expect my daughter to jump into your arms before you asked her? She would not have been her mother's child had she done any such thing, nor do I think she would have been mine. The Dunhams like plain dealing as well as the King's Majesty, but they are no jumpers. Leave me to manage this matter for you, Pathfinder, and there shall be no unnecessary delay. I'll speak to Mabel myself this very evening, using your name as principal in the affair."
I'd rather not, Sergeant. Leave the matter to Mabel and me, and I think we will all come right in the end. Young girls are like timorsome birds. They do not over relish being hurried or spoken harshly to neither. Leave the matter to Mabel and me."
"On one condition I will, my friend, and that is that you will promise me, on the honor of a scout, that you will put the matter plainly to Mabel the first suitable opportunity, and no mincing of words."
"I will ask her, Sergeant, on condition that you promise not to meddle in the affair. Yes, I will promise to ask Mabel whether she will marry me, even though she laugh in my face at my doing so, on that condition." Sergeant Dunham gave the desired promise very cheerfully, for he had completely wrought himself up into the belief that the man he had so much esteemed himself must be acceptable to his daughter. He had married a woman much younger than himself, and he saw no unfitness in the respective years of the intended couple. Mabel was educated so much above him, too, that he was not aware of the difference which actually existed between the parent and child in this respect. It followed that Sergeant Dunham was not altogether qualified to appreciate his daughter's tastes, or to form a very probable conjecture what would be the direction taken by those feelings which oftener depend on impulses and passion than on reason. Still, the worthy soldier was not so wrong in his estimate of the Pathfinder's chances as might at first appear. Knowing all the sterling qualities of the man, his truth, integrity of purpose, courage, self-devotion, disinterestedness, it was far from unreasonable to suppose that qualities like these would produce a deep impression on any female heart, and the father erred principally in fancying that the daughter might know, as it might be by intuition, what he himself had acquired by years of intercourse and adventure. As Pathfinder and his military friend descended the hill to the shore of the lake, the discourse did not flag. The latter continued to persuade the former that his diffidence alone prevented complete success with Mabel, and that he had only to persevere in order to prevail. Pathfinder was much too modest by nature, and had been too plainly, though so delicately, discouraged in the recent interview to believe all he heard. Still the father used so many arguments which seemed plausible, and it was so grateful to fancy that the daughter might yet be his, that the reader is not to be surprised when he is told that this unsophisticated being did not view Mabel's recent conduct in precisely the light in which he may be inclined to view it himself. He did not credit all that the Sergeant told him, it is true, but he began to think virgin coyness and ignorance of her own feelings might have induced Mabel to use the language she had. "The quartermaster is no favorite," said Pathfinder in answer to one of his companion's remarks. "Mabel will never look on him as more than one who has had 4 or 5 wives already." "Which is more than his share. A man may marry twice without offence to good morals and decency, I allow, but 4 times is an aggravation." "I should think even marrying once what Master Cap calls a circumstance," put in Pathfinder, laughing in his quiet way, for by this time his spirits had recovered some of their buoyancy. "It is indeed, my friend, and a most solemn circumstance, too. If it were not that Mabel is to be your wife, I would advise you to remain single. But here is the girl herself, and discretion is the word. Ah's me, Sergeant, I fear you are mistaken." End of chapter.